Okay, it's quarter past 6 where I am. I'm not sure what time it is where you all are. So I think we can get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for a very special discussion. I'm really excited to be here with our wonderful panelists to discuss the impact of the climate crisis on racialized communities in Europe. I just wanted to let everyone know that this conversation is going to be interpreted. So if you would like to follow along in French or German, you can click the little link, the little globe icon on the bottom taskbar, and our interpreters will be able to fill you in. And there's not going to be any breakout rooms, so there's not to worry about that. But if you'd like to ask a question, I believe you can type it into the chat, and that will, I'm not sure if you can type it into your language, and that can be interpreted, but we'll see how that works. So my name is Nadia Asri, and I am the Network Development Officer at ENAR, the European Network Against Racism. And I'd first like to start by thanking 350.org for organising this wonderful platform that has allowed ENAR to give you all a sneak peek of our upcoming report, which is titled "The Climate Crisis is a Colonial Crisis, Experiences, Responses and Steps Towards Decolonising Climate Action," which will be released, we're hoping, in the early summer. So the climate crisis is a global crisis, and while poor communities in the global south are hit hardest by this crisis, racialized communities in Europe are specifically and disproportionately impacted. The climate crisis is unfolding here and now for many racialized communities. And so with this report, we're aiming to give a platform to these communities, their stories and experiences, and to begin to lay the groundwork for strategic decolonizing and anti-racist climate action and analysis. This conversation and the conversation in the report more widely is a means for us to really understand how colonialism created the conditions for the climate change and still drives its impacts today, and how these impacts are already affecting racialized communities and minority communities in Europe. To have this conversation, I have with me 4 incredible speakers who've all contributed to the report and who are going to share with you their thoughts, perspectives and stories. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So with us, we have Archana Ramanujam, who is an organizer and researcher who works on understanding how colonial capitalism drives the climate crisis and how to dismantle this relationship through decolonization and democratization. Archana was a founding organizer at Climate Liberation Bloc, which used to work on anti-racist and decolonizing climate action in the Netherlands. She also founded and organized with Fossil Free Feminists, or the FFF, until very recently. FFS is a collective that continues to advance eco-feminist approaches to the climate crisis. Importantly, Archana is the author of ENAR's upcoming report on colonial capitalism and the climate crisis in Europe. And she is currently working on her PhD on these same topics at Brown University in the United States, and is an uninvited guest on Abenaki land, otherwise known as Vermont. So thank you, Archana. Next, I have Ghislain Verdeux, who's joining us. Ghislain joined CRIN, the Conseil Représentatif des Associations Noires, in 2014, where he became the person in charge of police and civil society relations, and in June 2018 became its president. Ghislain's approach to his work is always intersectional, and at CRIN he collaborates with many activist collectives across France, in Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, Nantes, Marseille, and more, including organizations such as the Collectif des Rosas, l'Union Juive pour la Paix, le Collectif Afro-Femme, le Collectif contre l'islamophobie en France, le Brigade anti-négrophobie, la Voix des Roms, Synergie Outre-mer, the LRFA, and le Réseau des Femmes Afro-Descendantes. Ghislain's work is also recognized at a European level, where in November 2018, he brought together with several European Afro-descendant organizations recommendations to the European Parliament. And he also coordinates several working groups to improve the fundamental rights of discriminated people, whatever their origin, their sex, their gender, their religion, and more. And in June 2019, Ghislain was elected for a 3-year term as ENAR's Vice vice chair on our board. With me, I also have Ines Siddiqui. Ines is the founder of Get Up, a grassroots organisation aimed at fostering social and economic and environmental justice in the banlieue of Paris. The organisation's goals are to challenge the current narratives around the youth of the banlieue, who are second-generation immigrants, and to build capacity, agency, and youth empowerment in the communities, and to challenge leaders and decision-makers for more equality. Since 2016, more than 5,000 young people have benefited from the organisation's programme. Ines is also a journalist and directed the web documentary Nos Darons about what it means to be the child of an immigrant in Paris, in France, in 2021. And lastly, but not least, I have Martin Collins, who is the co-director of Pavey Point Traveller and Roma Centre, and has been a traveller rights activist for over 30 years. He represented Pavey Point on the government task force on travellers in Ireland, I believe, in the early 90s, which resulted in a shift into interculturalism in terms of the government's approach to traveller issues. He was a strong advocate for state recognition of traveller ethnicity, which took place in 2017. Martin was also a human rights commissioner between 2002 and 2007, and he is currently a member of the Advisory Committee for the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. So, thank you very much everyone for joining us. Thank you again to the panelists, it's great to have you. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that we're going to be taking questions throughout this discussion. So please note them down, put them in the chat, and we will hope to kind of come to as many as possible. And first, I'd like to kind of go to our channel and ask you about the relationship between colonialism, capitalism, and climate change. So my question for you, Archana, is how did colonialism provide the foundation for climate change to happen?
Thanks, Nadia, for those brilliant introductions. I'm really glad to be here in the company of the other panelists and also the audience. So thanks. So you asked about the relationship between colonialism, capitalism, and climate change. So, you know, in recent years, there's been an increasing awareness within the climate movement of the links between specifically capitalism and climate change. You know, we have various frames or paradigms to look at this. You know, one is that never-ending growth moves us past the carrying capacity of the earth. Another focuses on the fact that we use GDP as a measure of well-being instead of focusing on true social and ecological well-being. And a third way looks at how fossil fuel companies and other polluting companies consistently put profit over people and climate in terms of extraction and emissions. You know, the government does not step in to regulate, and you know, this is framed as the problem. And I think, you know, while these frameworks are helpful, they aren't enough. These approaches don't explain why poor racialized communities are hardest hit worldwide, as you mentioned, Nadia, you know, from the islands of Kiribati in the Pacific to indigenous communities in what is known as, now known as North America, island nations in the Caribbean, as well as traveler communities within Europe. And we'll hear about, you know, some of these communities today from our panelists. So this is what I would call a relatively ahistorical approach that ignores race in the story. Even if there's merit to this approach, it's incomplete and it doesn't give us the full picture. So if we look at the development of capitalism, you know, it starts in Europe in the 16th to 17th century. Europeans were concurrently leaving to trade with or conquer other parts of the world. So not only do colonialism and capitalism coincide, but they are really integral to one another. They are bedfellows in a sense. Capitalism provides a framework to accumulate wealth, and colonialism provides the places and the people to extract from and to enrich Europe. You know, so this could mean the extraction of lives and labor through slavery or indentured labor, or it could mean the extraction of natural resources through mining. It could mean the exploitation of land through plantations. And in the context of settler colonialism, so in countries like the United States, Australia, and the Caribbean, local indigenous communities were killed or assimilated. So when we think about colonialism, racialization, or the process of creating other races and identifying others to that race is really a necessary part of this, the foundation, if you like. So this puts white colonizing Europeans on one side, and then racializing others who do not belong to this group of white Europeans. And these groups end up being Black, Roma, Brown, traveler communities as examples. So there are many scholars like Du Bois or C.L.R. James and others who have done a lot of work on this, just if people are interested in understanding the history of it more. But all this to say, when I speak about racialized communities, it means people who are seen to be different or other because of their race by white communities, or as compared to white people. So colonized communities, which are largely racialized communities, are in this way the targets of colonial capitalism, in the same way that the land and our collective resources are targeted. So if you can see that the mechanisms are the same, but they also reinforce each other. So what does this mean in the context of climate change? Due to this incredible wealth extraction, racialized communities around the world are set back and do not have the resources to tackle climate change, like build dikes against rising sea levels, or build sturdier houses to withstand hurricanes, and generally work on climate adaptation. In some cases, like in the Caribbean, there are ways in which the placement of houses by French colonists and the way that they structured villages and the raw materials they made them of made the local community less resilient to hurricanes as compared to how indigenous communities built their homes and their villages. Moreover, the wealth that was extracted has allowed global North countries to engender the climate crisis in the first place by consuming and emitting in vast quantities. So in the sense, we're talking about fossil fuels and CO2 emissions, but in the context of a larger ecological crisis, we're also talking about monocropping on plantations, pesticide use, and pollution as equally relevant. And Ghislaine will talk a little bit more about this in the context of Guadeloupe and Martinique. So the takeaway point from this is really that this historical responsibility follows a colonial dynamic. And in this way, colonialism isn't an event that happened in the past and is done, but the dynamics of it are reproduced today through climate crisis and the inequities that it causes, as well as things like the COVID pandemic, for example. Colonialism is at the root, and we can't look at overconsumption of white wealthy Europeans or North Americans or Australians or South Africans for that matter, without linking this to the extraction from racialized or indigenous communities locally or in former colonies abroad. And so while the dynamics I've described are worldwide and often specifically between a colonizing country and a colonized country, the dynamics within Europe also resemble these global colonial dynamics. So racialized communities in Europe have many stories. They could be the diaspora of countries which were colonized, and we'll hear a little bit more about this from Ines about Black and Moroccan communities in France. And that immigration link is really due to this colonial link of people moving back and forth. They could also be or racialized communities could also be native to a country but not treated as full citizens, which Martin will probably speak a little bit about in the context of the traveler community in Ireland. So while racialized communities in Europe may live in wealthy countries that can afford some climate adaptation and resilience programs, they are often still living in highly polluted areas near highways or airports, as Inez might talk about a little bit about. And this air pollution will only get worse as climate disruption ensues and our climate gets hotter. And racialized communities may be systematically excluded from accessing simple public services like, water or electricity, utilities, as Martin will likely speak a little bit about. And access to water and electricity will become all the more important as temperatures rise and, as these utilities get scarcer. So yeah, I want to end by just saying that there are also other lines along which climate disruption impacts people unequally, which can in part also be traced back to colonial impositions. For example, colonialism also imposed certain social ideas of gender on indigenous communities, for example. And climate now also disproportionately impacts women or non-binary people because of these social constructions which lead to inequality. So I hope this presents a bit of a framework and sets the stage for others to talk more about their experiences and that of their communities. And I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Archana. Thank you very much for your insightful answer, which has kind of, I hope, framed the discussion, and for also outlining the perspective that the report is grounded in. I think that would be really helpful for everyone to understand. And now I wanted to give a chance for the other panelists to share with us their testimonies and outline their local realities with regards to the already true impact of the climate crisis on racialized communities and minority communities in Europe. So first I'd like to turn to Martin, and I'd like to ask you, Martin, to share the reality that traveller communities in Ireland are facing with regards to the climate crisis already. Martin, I think you're on mute because I can't quite hear you speak.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much, Nadia. And it's great to be here with you this evening, and indeed the other panelists and those others who may be tuning into this conversation. Last Thursday, the 8th of April, was a very significant and a very historic day. It was the 50th anniversary since the first National Roma Congress took place in London in 1971. And it was really an attempt to create a pan-European political platform to give a voice to Roma and travellers, to advocate for an end to racism, exclusion, to look for better living conditions, employment opportunities, and so forth. It was also, as many of your listeners will know, and indeed the panelists, on that occasion, they also adopted the Roma flag and indeed adopted the Roma anthem, Jelm Jelm Jelm. So it was a very historic day. That's 50 years ago. And when one reflects, and you ask yourself the question, what have we achieved in those 50 years in terms of a movement, a social movement? And while there has been some gains and while there has been some achievements, it's certainly true to say there are many, many challenges remaining to be addressed for travellers and Roma. It's well documented, that travellers and Roma in Europe, numbering approximately 14 million people, continue to experience huge levels of systemic, institutional, structural racism, poor educational outcomes, segregated education, segregated residential areas, high unemployment, huge health inequalities. I mean, this is the ongoing experience of travellers and Roma in Europe. We also know that 1 in 3 Roma travellers in Europe don't have any access to water, a very basic essential. And indeed, many others, lack access to electricity and sanitation. We also know from various research that 80% of Roma travellers in Europe live under the poverty line. Now, this is in the context, that the European Union and the continent of Europe is quite a wealthy, corner of the earth. And yet we have a significant number of travellers and Roma and indeed other ethnic groups living in really precarious situations where their human rights are essentially being violated on a daily basis. So this context and this lived experience has to inform any strategy and policy designed to address climate change and make the transition to climate justice. You know, we know, as Shana has said, we know, you know, beyond a doubt that it's the poor, the marginalized communities and ethnic groups who lack power and who lack influence are the least able and they are the least supported to mitigate the effects of climate justice, both within countries and indeed between countries. And obviously that has to change. And in any strategy or policy designed to address climate change and achieve climate justice, it needs a number of core values. It needs to be built on equality. It needs to be built on respect for human rights, and it needs to be built on justice. Those are core values that need to be enshrined in any policy or strategy to address climate change and make the transition to climate justice. And if that doesn't happen, we run the risk of both amplifying and reinforcing the inequality and the human rights violations that travellers and Roma and indeed other ethnic minorities experience. We know, for example, that travellers and Roma, in relation to accommodation, they live in really poor living conditions, lacking sanitation, electricity and water, and quite often are located in areas that's prone to flooding and lack a basic infrastructure. That is the common experience of travellers and Roma right across Europe, as is documented by FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, and indeed other international human rights institutions. In terms of my own experience in Ireland, I suppose I come from a very unique experience in that on the island of Ireland, as an Irish person, you know, I have a shared experience with other Irish people who are not travellers, in the sense that we were a colonised nation for over 800 years. And we were denied the means of food production. And of course, we know about the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1840s, where millions of people died of starvation. And indeed, many other millions emigrated all over the globe to America, Australia, England, Canada, and so forth. So I have that shared experience with other Irish people. But I also have a very distinct experience as a member of an ethnic minority in Ireland known as the Traver people. And unfortunately, that experience is one of exclusion, discrimination, poor living conditions, and the denial of cultural identity until March 2017, when the state officially recognised Travellers as a minority ethnic group, which was a really big achievement. But our identity was always ridiculed, vilified, dehumanized, that we didn't have a culture of worth. We didn't have our culture was inferior to settled people's culture. So the whole racist ideology, prevailed for many decades, if not centuries, on the island of Ireland. And as a result of that, there were various attempts essentially to get rid of Travellers through policies of assimilation and so forth. So in terms of the climate justice issue, there's a very couple of basic issues here for Travellers. One is in Ireland, many Traveller sites are in very remote, isolated areas, away from the local infrastructure like schools, shops, health service. Many of these sites lack basic essentials such as running water, sanitation. We're living now in the middle of a global health pandemic, and unfortunately we have 3,000 plus Travellers who can't even meet the basic public requirement of washing their hands as part of the COVID-19 public health guidelines. It's absolutely appalling. And then, of course, many of these Traveller sites don't have green spaces for young Traveller children to, play or have recreational activities and so forth. And one of the direct consequences, and I'll finish here, one of the direct consequences of not having electricity is actually food poverty. Food poverty, because if you don't have access to electricity, you obviously don't have a fridge. And if you don't have a fridge, you can't go to the supermarket and buy bulk items that might be in special offer because they will go off very quickly. So you live from day to day and you just buy the bare essentials from day to day. That's an additional cost on a community who have an unemployment rate of 80%, an 80% unemployment rate. And this is just another financial burden, which is driving many travelers into poverty and indeed into hunger, because they can't buy bulk items because they don't have electricity. Likewise, washing clothes. We don't have many traveler families don't have the facilities to wash clothes. So you have to use laundrettes, which are way beyond where you live, because as I said, most traveler sites are in very remote, isolated areas. So there's an additional cost there as well, and many of these traveler settlements, I call them that, don't actually have a bus service either. So you have to walk. Now, you might say that's environmentally friendly, that's very green. Of course it is, but it has its other problems as well. If you're carrying a heavy load of clothes to a laundrette, where there's an additional cost because you don't have a washing machine. So this is all as a direct result of not having electricity. And then the last point, and that's regardless of how electricity is generated. Of course, you'd like to see electricity generated by renewables. Of course you would, but electricity needs to be made available to everyone, regardless of ethnicity. And then finally, there are travelers who do have some travelers who have a generator which gives some electricity, but that's actually quite limited. It will only give power to one light and a television. It's not sufficiently strong enough to work a fridge or a washing machine on. But of course, the other consequence of these are diesel generators. They let out a lot of emissions, and they're quite dangerous, for traveler children who are around who would be inhaling the fumes from these generators. So again, that's, and obviously it's not good for the climate or the environment either. So really what I'm trying to say here is, I finish with this, that our leaders, our policymakers and our legislators who are concerned about climate change and climate justice, they need to be very, very sensitive and very cognizant that, there are groups who are disproportionately impacted, as Angela has said, Roma, travellers, and indeed other ethnic minorities and indigenous peoples. And moving forward, we need to be very conscious of that, and we need to be very, core to that needs to be issues of equality, justice, and human rights. And not only that, but also the participation of those communities. They need to be directly involved in the formulation of these policies and strategies. This is not something to be done by academics or the privileged or the elite. It's important that indigenous groups, ethnic minorities, including travellers and Roma, are directly involved in the processes whereby these strategies and these policies get developed. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you, Martin, for kind of sharing your testimony and your ideas and shining some light onto the realities of travellers and Roma in Europe, but also for kind of for thinking about these ideas about streamlining values in policy making and centering marginalized voices in policy making in order to really ask them what they need and in order to respond to that, because that's the only way that we can move forward. And I think that's a really important point to make. So thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to Ghislain for kind of your discussion and for you to kind of share your testimony that you shared with our channel for the report.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all. Thank for the presentation, and thank you to the previous speaker for his testimony. I will take, to be straight, a concrete example of the consequences of what our topic is related here. We're talking about climate and race, and right now in France we have very strong cases concerning the pollution, because when we're talking about climate, we're talking about ecology too. And in France we have example of a toxic who was used in Guadeloupe and Martinique, and the project name is the chlordécone. Right now there is a huge action is being since several years now, and the consequences on the health of the population are huge. And today in Martinique and Guadeloupe, 90% of the population are contaminated. Well, to know the context, let's me give you some data. And this project was forbidden in the United States, and still was authorized. The French government gave the authorization to use it in 1973, and knowing that that project was very toxic. And to make it short, and a lot of organizations did many action to against the state, the government, to tackle it, but nothing happened. On July 2019, a parliamentary committee has been held on this important topic, and since many organizations, associations, like our organization called Le Cran, with our partner in Guadeloupe and Martinique, like Association Vivre, another association called Liénage pour Dépolluer Martinique, for depollution of Martinique. We did many actions to mobilize, to give information to the citizen, to mobilize the population, and with the support of one of our lawyers called Christophe Legevec, and with many others like the researcher called Malcolm Ferdinand, who is a writer and a researcher, and with many partners in Guadeloupe and Martinique. What we did, what I can say is that the first action who was implemented was in the year 2000, and that was an action to the court, but nothing happened. Another action was 30 years ago in 2006, 2007. Nothing happened again. We did a new action 2 years ago now with this organization, this collective action, and this procedure is innovated. Why? Because in complementary of the other procedure launched over 30 years in Guadeloupe and elsewhere, this procedure is complementary, and that it attacks the state by developing a new legal argument. It will show that the state has been defective in its mission to protect the population, which constitute both a violation of paragraph 10 and 12 of the preamble of the 1946 Constitution and the Environmental Charter. It's important to have this complete information. This action is innovative because it draws lesson from the latest case concerning toxic project by targeting only the moral damage resulting from the anxiety of the people who face a project that pollute and for centuries, and are source of serious and fatal damage. What we need to say at this point is that this project, the ground, the sea, and the vegetable are contaminated for centuries, for more than 300 years. This is a huge scandal, And the French authority were aware what's going on. And today, in 2021, we know that the population are contaminated. 90% of the population are contaminated. So this is more than scandals. And finally, because of the collective nature of the action, it means that each citizen can individually lodge a complaint against the state through the dedicated organization who are part of this collective action on the court against the state, with the goal of mobilize citizens and use that collective action that is proposed directly to those who live in the West Indies, Guadeloupe and Martinique, so people from the grassroots. Those people who live there now and in the past, everyone can act on this collective action as individual or as association. And what is important to say is that everyone can act on this. You, us, experts, can and must in a coalition work all together to achieve a concrete result on this unacceptable situation that we are all concerned on. This is one of the testimony I can give. And before carry on, this is the example I wanted to give about one cases in France. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for sharing that. And I think that, you know, we can later go into a more in detailed conversation about it. But I really do thank you for your sharing your testimony. It was great to hear you speak. And I'd like to go over to Ines to share what you spoke with Archana about the people living in the banlieue in Paris who are already experiencing kind of negative effects of the climate crisis.
Of course, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the previous panelists who shared a lot of, you know, very good content and great analysis of what's going on in the intersections between discriminations and you know, climate justice or injustice. So yeah, I had the pleasure to discuss all these issues with our channel some months ago, and we spoke about what is, you know, top of the agenda here in the banlieue of France. So the banlieue are like the suburbs around major cities, and it's so in France it's like the most privileged areas are the city centers, and the suburbs are the most vulnerable territories. And so just to say a few words about where I speak from. So my name is Ines Sediki. I'm the founder of Get Up, which is a grassroots organization that you described earlier. So our work is to challenge the narrative, but also to create capacity within communities, and especially within the youth of the communities, to take action and advocate for their rights, from social justice, economic justice to climate justice. And it's actually, the last one is climate justice is the bit that is the hardest to explain or to create connections with when it comes to working with the young people. They're mostly, you know, they want to fight police brutality, they want to fight economic crisis, they want to fight all those things that they feel like are the most pressing issues for them. And it's usually hard to create like this link and make them understand that it's part of the same system, and it should be also their priorities. But more and more young people are concerned by this topic and feel like they should take action on it, and it's really encouraging in a way. So what we spoke about with Archana was the different the different mobilizations that were existing in the banlieue that have happened in the past, you know, like years. And mostly what the most pressing issues here are air pollution first. So you know how like there's like underprivileged neighborhoods and cities are outside of Paris, but most of the time close to the ring, you know, like this like major road around Paris that links the different banlieues, the different suburbs. And there are a lot of like major highways and roads that pass by those cities, and there's a lot of pollution. And so one major road access is the A86, which is one of the biggest roads in Europe too. And a lot of cities of the banlieue are like on that road, right? And directly, like they can see the road, they can hear the road, they can, you know, like breathe it too. And so there have been a lot of like studies to show that the cities that are closest to roads have up to 30% more asthma rates than you know, other cities. And there was actually like one of the first lawsuit that was carried against the French state. I think it was a year or 2 years ago, because of like the state not doing enough to prevent from those like this pollution to affect the citizens of those cities. It's still in progress. I will share a couple of articles in the chat after to illustrate what I'm saying a bit more. The second thing is like all those construction projects that are you know, coming up in the suburbs, starting with the Olympic Games that are going to happen in Paris. So all like the parties and the nice restaurants and the conferences are going to happen in Paris, but the games and the constructions to supply the games are going to happen are happening currently in the suburbs. So we have like a couple metro stations that are going to make the prices higher, but mostly it's like destroying potential farming lands or just like green environment to construct like those big stadiums or apartment buildings that are going to host the players and the journalists and all those things. Malls also are like a big issue. Like we're extracting a lot of land to create more malls. Like there's like a high number of malls per like inhabitants in the suburb. Like, but this is all we do, right? We don't need culture, we don't need farms, we just need like shopping centers. And so people are mobilizing against that too. So one of them is Europa City, which was like the latest one, like the mall. And so the activists that were fighting this project actually won earlier this year. I'm also going to be dropping an article on that in the chat. And yeah, so you know, like just to sum it up, and yeah, one last thing, a lot of those activists that are fighting all those like construction projects, air pollution, some of them come from the suburbs, the banlieue, right? And but like a large part of those activists are not living in those cities and are just trying to push, like create a momentum around those issues to try and pass on some knowledge. But it's really hard to, you know, like convince those inhabitants that are looking for a job, fighting police brutality, trying to have their kids, you know, do their homework or just, you know, struggle on a daily basis to tackle those issues. So there's still like this challenge to onboard like those populations to take on the fight and own it more. And so this is my last point, but you know, generally speaking, just like climate injustice is like the consequences disproportionately affecting racialized communities. It's also not benefiting from the social progress or the environmental progress we can experience in major cities like in inner city of Paris or other. This is also like a way that we are in which we are affected, not being able to eat good food, where, you know, some people eat like vegan, like superior quality stuff, and we don't even have those products in our like shopping centers. And the last thing, and this was my last point, I think the biggest inequality is actually not being able to fight back those things as much as we could, because as I said, we are very much caught by, you know, the rest, like the zillion other you know, like structural issues that we're facing on a daily basis. And I think to me it's the most like it's the most frustrating thing and the most unfair thing is to not fighting with the same tools, or not having the opportunities just to fight, not having the knowledge, not having the space and access to decision makers to advocate for those topics. And I think this is like the biggest challenge for all the grassroots organization, especially those working with the youth, to try and equip them to be able to fight and have a voice in this conversation.
Thank you, Ines, for kind of sharing that reality, which kind of demonstrates quite clearly that our analysis of the climate crisis must be intersectional and kind of grounded in a race-class analysis. I think that's a really important point. I wanted to remind everyone that we're going to be taking questions at the end, so please do keep noting them down, because you will have a chance to ask the panelists any questions you have. And Martin, I wanted to come to you. I know that you might have to leave because of a mess up with the timings, but while you're still here, I'd like to come to you. Are you still here, Martin? Maybe you're not still here. I'll ask you the question. If you're still here, you can answer. If not, we can move on. But I wanted to ask you how existing barriers that European minorities face in terms of kind of some of the things you mentioned with access to education, safe accommodation, health services, make them more exposed to the climate crisis. But maybe you're not here. Martin did say that he would have to leave a bit early because we had a mess up with the timings. So if you're gone, I think you might be. We can move on to another question. And Gisela, I can come to you. if that's okay. So you kind of, the testimony that you gave illustrated quite clearly the relationship between colonialism, global power dynamics, and the climate crisis, and racialized people being impacted disproportionately by them. So I wanted to ask you, why is Europe so far behind in addressing the colonial roots of climate change? And additionally, how could the EU better address the colonial foundations of climate change?
Yes, thank you, Nadia, for this two questions. Well, for the first question, why Europe is so far behind in understanding climate change and connection to colonialism, I have to say that the analysis is quite simple, if I can say. The first thing to note is that the consequences that we are facing today in 2021 are directly linked with action and work organization that had been implemented under the colonization. As example, we know that in some area in the West Indies, in Africa, for example, were used under colonialism time as a plantation, for example. Lot of products that are needed today in Europe from this area. For example, banana, coffee, cotton, spice, vanilla, etc. All this for the well-being of Occidental country depend on ignoring the consequences concerning the health of the local population, because if these area are transformed as plantation of the European country, if I can say that, there is consequences that we cannot ignore. And now about the second question, how EU could better address colonial foundation on climate change? Well, the first thing to link is to understand that EU is well aware of what's going on today. We have a lot of civil society who work on this situation. For example, we know that in the UA today, we face a lot of vague of what we call asylum seekers, for example, who are pushed away from their homeland and country because of the exploitation of, as Akana said, with the extractivism, for example, exploitation of their homeland, and they arrive in Europe, and the first thing they face is social declassification. They are assigned to a new social identification by the EU institution. For example, we know that EU institution call them migrant, and this is an axiom. And so the first thing we must be aware is that the first consequences are the psychology difficulty. But when we say that, to answer to the question, is that yes, if we want to if what EU institution can do, they must work with the political authority in this country, in Africa, because if they don't work with the local country, that will be difficult to have the real impact on what's going on. And the second thing is, yes, work with the African EU and African Union and with the local authority, and most of that, and they must work with the civil society too, because we have many civil organizations from civil society who work on this topic, who are well aware on what's going on with the real people. So EU must really work with the country, African Union, and the civil society who work on this issue.
Thank you for your answer, Gisela. I think that that's a really important point to make, that we cannot continue, or decision makers, policy makers cannot continue in the way that they're going now, without including grassroots voices, non-European voices, non-white voices. And until and this is a kind of a similar point to what Martin was making, until we center those voices in our policy making, in our decision making, we will not be able to kind of develop fit for purpose and effective targeting solutions to achieve racial justice, climate justice, any sorts of justice, equity and equality in Europe. So I think that that's a really great point, and thank you very much for making it so eloquently. I'd like to come back to Ines now. Ines, you spoke about, you know, when you were sharing your testimony, you spoke about how the negative impacts of the climate crisis kind of are directly related to the structure of cities and urbanization. And so I'd kind of like to ask you a little bit more about the role that you think structural racism plays in impacting in minorities in Europe, as in the role that structural racism plays in the fact that the climate crisis is disproportionately impacting racialized minorities in Europe. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
I think it was mostly the point that I was trying to make earlier during the testimony. I think the biggest role of structural racism is to keep those like vulnerable people, minorities from different backgrounds, you know, under the weather, you know, like just so caught up with everyday life, just trying to, you know, make it to the end of the month, try to, you know, find a bigger apartment because you're like so many people living in the same flat, finding jobs for your children or for yourself, or, you know, it's just all of those realities that just make people stay or be kept in the urgency of their everyday life, just reacting to things and preventing them from really organizing, from really strategizing, from really fundraising. It's really hard to do this work on the you know, like grassroots level. It's really hard to make room and time for that. And the key is to link with those everyday thing that happen to people. So asthma, access to good food, you know, also trying to link bad infrastructures, bad heating systems with the fact that it costs more money to the poorest to live in this like those high consuming buildings, not really like ecological and stuff like that, to try and engage them in the conversation. I noticed also that this system doesn't equip those people, like in school, on TV, we don't talk about this. We don't teach to these people the tools and the understanding that they need to have to really be able to reflect on what they live and create new models, new solutions. And when they do, when they find the strength, the tools, the courage, the organizing to take action. I'm thinking, for example, a collective that's called Front de Mer, so the Mothers Front. It's like a union of mothers in the underprivileged areas around Paris or across France, actually. And there's actually one office in a small group in Brussels now that's carrying on the work. It's just like mothers of most of the time immigrant descent or just living in those very underprivileged areas that are trying to organize for a better society for their children. And they're having this very intersectional approach, crossing racism, sexism, and also environmental action. And they, for example, they've been in the last years trying to push for vegan alternatives at school, so on lunch breaks, just for, you know, kids to have decent meals, not eating meat all the time, and have access to, you know, like organic food. And you know how like in Europe we have this very obsession with Muslim people, and you know, there's this very rampant Islamophobia. And so the responses those women have, those mothers have, trying to advance vegan options at schools, that they're trying to, you know, Islamize school, and just like to remove pork or meat because they want to eat halal. And so this is also like the level, another level on how this system is just trying to mute all the initiatives that come from those racialized and minorities communities that are trying to create an alternative, to create something, a space, a political space for themselves. And I think it's very interesting to see how they're fighting it. I will also drop an article in there. I dropped actually an article on the Front de Mer. So it's nice, it's interesting to see how, you know, what the reactions are and how they're trying to fight this actually very, you know, like cool and progressive kind of union. Everyone is like, oh, in the suburbs, the parents are not involved in their children's life. They're, you know, not really caring for them. And this is why they become blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And when they actually try and organize, this is the responses they get. So I think it's interesting to see that level of pushback also on a systemic, you know, level.
Yeah, thank you, Ines. And I think you made a couple of points there, and I think one of the points you made kind of quite clearly ties back to the point that Martin was making earlier, about how existing inequalities in terms of healthcare and education and basic kind of human rights, like the right to access water and accommodation, and how that kind of exacerbates inequalities, because, you know, you might be living near a big road and you might be more kind of at risk of getting asthma. But then when you go to the doctor, medical racism exists. So when you go to the doctor and you try and access healthcare, you're faced with another barrier. And it's the fact that all of these kinds of inequalities, all of these structures are interlinked, and without kind of tackling them from a holistic and intersectional viewpoint, there is no way to adequately address them. And I think that that's a really, really, really interesting point that you and Martin and Gisela have all kind of made. And, you know, we've kind of, throughout this discussion, we've kind of been hearing from our panelists that European minorities are most impacted already. So why are we not hearing minority voices? It's like kind of centered at the forefront of climate action. Why is climate action so white? And I wanted to come to you, Archana, to ask you this as someone who has experience as a climate activist, to ask why our climate movements are so white, and also to kind of ask how you see the issue of far-right influence within the climate movement.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. So I think this panel and, you know, other struggles we know of show that there are plenty of people of color and racialized people working on the front lines, you know, whether it's within Europe or around the world. You know, beyond what we've heard today, there's, you know, folks in Nigeria fighting the oil company Shell, to indigenous communities fighting drilling and mining for heavy metals in Nordic countries. So this is, you know, there's a bit of a disconnect between that and sort of the mainstream climate movement in Europe. And I think it has to do with how climate disruption has been articulated, you know, that it speaks largely to a white audience. So someone, a compatriot of mine, always says, you know, it always gets framed in terms of polar bears and ppm. So on the one hand, it's framed in terms of, you know, animal welfare, which is an important part of it. But what happens is other forms of devastation happening to people of color in this crisis get ignored, you know, and this gets prioritized. So, and then on the other hand, it often becomes about a very technical issue of parts per million. And I think Inez spoke about this, you know, it's really hard to care about these things when your everyday existence is threatened by not having enough water to drink, having bad air to breathe, little access to accommodation or sanitation, and just the general issue of facing racism on an everyday basis. And this is really the reality for racialized communities across Europe. And the thing is, like, these everyday realities are absolutely part of environmental and climate justice or injustices, but they're not included in the sort of mainstream vision of what climate struggle is about. And this is the effect of excluding racialized communities who don't see their problems represented. And you know, additionally, and I spoke about this as well, there's this aspect of scapegoating immigrants that happens, you know, also in the mainstream climate movement. You know, that immigrants are the ones to blame because they aren't as aware of environmental issues, and they're flying home to see their families from Europe. You know, this has been said to me. You know, you shouldn't have come here if you need to fly back. You know. In terms of, you know, flying having a large impact on emissions, which completely effaces the colonial history of exploitation and how the ties between immigrants' country of origin and European countries came about in the first place. And I think it also positions Europeans as knowing best, which is particularly ironic in the context of a crisis that really was created by people on this continent, you know. And so this leads to people of color not feeling welcome in these spaces that are, you know, actively hostile and racist at times, and contributes to a white climate movement. And so this ties a little bit into your second question, which was, you know, what is the role of the far right influence in the climate movement? And I have to say, I owe what I know on this to Hilary Moore, who wrote a really great publication called Burning Earth, Changing Europe, which is freely available. I can put it in the chat in a moment, but I encourage people to go look at it. Because, you know, pushing racist anti-immigration policies is really at the forefront of far-right politics, you know, and you can see how this has a trickle-down effect into the mainstream climate movement. So, like, even if far-right parties are generally pretty skeptical or even downright denialist of climate disruption, some people are beginning to see that young people care about climate change and are trying to incorporate this into their platform to broaden their base. You know, Viktor Orban in Hungary is a good example of this. He came out with a Christian Democratic set of climate policies last year, which trying to save the climate, you know, for our children, you know, which leaves no real quibbles about who he's talking about, you know, Hungarian children. And we see this dynamic in the mainstream climate movement in a slightly different form. You know, white people for climate are often worried about future generations and focus on their own children instead of on the current devastation happening right now in Martinique, as Ghislaine talked about, or in traveler communities, as Martin spoke about, or, you know, Black and brown communities in France. So I think this is an important part of it. And I just want to say that this isn't a new phenomenon. You know, while environment and climate is often seen as a leftist issue, you know, environmental preservation and authoritarian racist tendencies have at various times come together. So most notably in Nazi Germany, you know, Hitler was a proponent of the idea that the Aryan race had a special connection with the land and was therefore more deserving of it, which justified their colonial land grabs for more Lebensraum. And I mean, today in Italy, there is also a neo-fascist group that is quite militant in terms of their anti-immigration stance, but also have an environmental wing to preserve their forests and trees as part of a nationalist project. So ultimately, you know, if climate groups are not careful and not actively taking anti-racist, anti-colonial stances, they will be vulnerable to these narratives. And sure, climate action and climate adaptation will happen, but it won't be just, you know, will simply reproduce neo-colonial dynamics.
Thank you, Artana. That answer was, you know, really thoughtful and insightful, and I'm really glad that you answered that in such a great way. And now I kind of wanted to move on to the Q&A, and we've already had a question in the chat from Sanka, which I believe kind of builds quite nicely on what you were saying, Artana, which is climate change is the driving force behind global conflicts. Countries which are poor because of colonialism are now most vulnerable to climate impact, and this drives climate migration. And also kind of migration due to civil conflicts that are kind of also rooted in in the climate crisis. Like Syria is quite a good example of this. And in Europe, these migrants, again, are facing systematic discrimination because they're migrants. And how should we understand this better? And I wanted to ask you first, Ghislain, and then maybe come to Archana and Ines if you wanted to also add something. I think you're maybe muted, Ghislain.
Yes, please, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, okay, so because of climate migration, we're having more increasing amounts of migrants coming to Europe because of natural disaster, and then when they come to Europe, they're facing systematic discrimination. How can we understand this better? How do we need to adjust and grapple with this and you know, you fight for the justice of migrants and people who have had to move like across the world because of their inability to stay and live in their homes?
Yeah, thank you. Archana spoke about that, and this is linked as a lot with extractivism. We know that today a lot of organization, Occidental organization, has the company in, let's talk about Africa, for example, and when there's company go there and do what they do, and they push the population away from the homeland, and there's population, they are pushed to go in the big city in Africa. If you can take the example of, for example, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and it's the same people that we found on the desert, and we find the same people on the sea, on the Mediterranean. And then when they arrive in Europe, we call them migrant, and forgetting that the first thing we did was to send company there. So this is a direct link, and here in Europe, people don't do that connection. And for us who are activists, it's quite obvious, but it's important to remind this. And the first thing, and the other thing is when there's people, I hate the word migrant, and because for me, migrant is, we all migrant, you know. And so the difficulty is that when there's people arrive here, the first thing they face is declassification. And because we have a lot of people that we call asylum seekers or migrant, who arrive here in Europe, and they have to start everything again. So the first thing is declassification, sorry, and the new social identification. And this is difficult to understand because the identification that the new European environment give to them, they don't recognize themselves in that identification. And we need to collectively to give more information to European citizens, wherever they're from, to make more obvious this link with European organizations who are doing extractivism in Africa and elsewhere, with the link with the people we call migrant, because there is a direct link that people don't do.
Thank you, Ghislain, for your point. I think that really answered the question, but if Archana or Ines, you'd like to add anything? No? Okay. Archana, are you thinking about adding?
Yeah, I mean, I can just give maybe another short example, because I think just like Ghislain was talking about pollution, I think climate also has similar impacts where, you know, climate disruption largely caused by wealthy European and cases North American countries is created, for example, in Afghanistan, which, you know, is a country from where a lot of people flee as refugees to Europe and surrounding countries. You know, climate disruption has had a huge impact on their climate. So created a lot of drought and lack of water in some places, and in other places flooding and glacier melts, landslides, which creates an environment which is unstable and makes people vulnerable to being recruited to the Taliban, for example, where they really don't have any prospects, or don't have water. And an organization is willing to give you access to these resources, but like this instability was created in the global north, and I think and then the war itself in these situations is also really devastating environmentally, as well as obviously the human impact, such that there really are no prospects, and then people then flee and then are really demonized as refugees, as Ghislaine was also referring to in the context of who's an immigrant, but also immigrants, having to go through years of processing on Mediterranean islands, and then on those islands also being exposed to the same impacts, perhaps in slightly different ways. So fires, because of the like we had on Lesbos last year, that really are so devastating for the local community because of cramped spaces, which is, not the people who live there's fault so much as like the EU's fault in terms of not dealing with the number of people who need shelter, and just other like lack of access again to water, sanitation, which has been pretty devastating in the COVID crisis as well. So I think every step of the way these inequities are reinforced by this this colonial dynamics.
Thank you, Artana. I also wanted to come, we have had another question from Sanka, but I think I'll go to somebody else and then come back to Sanka. We've got a question from Michaela. It's quite a personal question. So Michaela is going to be a teacher in Austria and definitely wants to educate her future students on all the different forms of oppression and how they're interconnected, etc. How can Michaela do this with students that are racialized and or marginalized without being a white savior and perpetuating colonial and racist hierarchies? That's a very good question, Michaela. Does anybody want to jump straight on it to answer, or should I?
Yeah.
Ghislaine, yeah?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. I think the best way as a teacher, as a human being, as a citizen, to try to give some value to our kids, because the kids are the future, is with the approach of intersectionality. Because with the approach of the intersectionality, we're not talking about race, gender, or sex. We're talking about all the discrimination. And it's important for kids to understand that today, all kind of discrimination can be linked and can be faced in the same way. For example, if in your classroom you have kids who are from the minority, other who are disabled, for example, other who face some discrimination, it's who are, for example, Christian or Muslim, it's easier to make sure that all of them are concerned to use the approach of intersectionality. The difficulty in the past was when we were only talking about some sort of discrimination. For example, when we were talking about only right now we're going into a Black Lives Matter, for example, and we find out that and it's normal. Other people say, yeah, we are talking about Black Lives Matter too much. We're not talking about Asian Lives Matter too. That's true, and it's very, very important to have this approach and to understand that, yes, and the easiest link is to say, yes, we can be Black and Muslim. Someone can be Black, Muslim, and gay, for example. And this is three kinds of discrimination that people can face: the being gay, being Muslim, and being Black. And I think the approach of intersectionality is very, very a good approach to teach kids how they can face collectively. I insist with this approach of collective way of fight all form of discrimination.
I think that's a very, very true point, Gisela. No one is free until we're all free. And I thank you, Michaela, for your question, because as a teacher, you have a real opportunity to shift the dynamics in classroom, to recognize power and privilege, to draw in all kind of sorts of different perspectives and analyses, and that's a really special opportunity. And I'm really glad that you're looking to ensure that it's a positive one for your students who are minoritized and racialized. So yes, I'd like to thank you. Does anyone want to add anything more to that question, Ines?
Yeah, I also think it was a great question, and I think it's also like the best way to approach change is to see from where you are and what you do, where are your powers and how you can use them to, as you said, like recenter racialized communities or help create more capacity for those youths. So my answer would be to create exposure to those debates, those topics, answer their questions, obviously, try and expose them to as many the conversations as possible, just because we've realized this that with our grassroots organization as well, is that they don't get enough exposure to what's going on in their country, but also in the world, in economics and geopolitics and everything. And at home they don't always have like the resources to try and build critical thinking on those topics. And I think school should be the main space where they do that. And I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is to continue to develop their critical thinking skills, skills in general, and just also see them as people who can take action, because most of the time when we speak to youth of minorities, we tend to we want to protect them, we want to tell them that life is not going to be easy or stuff like that. We never speak to their change maker potential, right? To their activist potential, to their entrepreneurial potential. In a different capacity, they can contribute to build different societies. And I think we also should keep that in mind when we speak to students or to youth, generally speaking, this action aspect and the power they can have in society.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you. Archana, if you don't want to add anything else, I think we have another question from Sanka, which is, sorry, I'm just trying to scroll up. Okay, which is, what is the impact of not including decolonial, anti-racist and anti-discrimination analyses more broadly in our conversations around the climate crisis and climate action, and how does this disproportionately affect racialized communities? So I think we've spoken about the reality of the climate crisis and the impact that that's already had, but what would the impact, I think this question is asking what the impact of continuing to ignore these perspectives and analyses within our climate action, what would that lead to, and how would that continue to disproportionately impact racialized communities, I think is the question, my interpretation of the question. Maybe we can start with Archana.
Sure, I think, thanks for your question, Sanka. I think that the danger is, as I've mentioned, that you end up reproducing these colonial inequities. And what does that mean? I think it means that the wealthy, largely white groups who can afford to adapt to climate disruption will build walls, keep immigrants of color out, continue to exclude communities like travelers from public services that become more and more important as temperatures rise, sea levels rise, so you have the disparities that we have today will continue to widen. And I think one aspect that has come to mind to me is also, as Ines was saying about political inequalities, I think these will also be reinforced. Largely because I think there's a big spatial dynamic aspect to this too. You know, I mean, if you think about Martinique and Guadeloupe, they are far away from Paris, where all the decisions are being made about what is going to happen and how France is going to adapt. As are the banlieue is far from the center, and less visible, you know. So I think Ghislain and Inès are doing really important work to improve the political voice of their communities. And I think if we don't do that, these gaps will widen. And I mean, this is also visible in the context of Martin's community, where he says, you know, travelers are largely isolated. And I think a lot of folks in Ireland actively try to push travelers out of their communities as undesirable, you know, occupying land that could be used otherwise. So I think those, you know, I think ultimately these gaps will widen. And I think, you know, the histories of genocide come to mind. And so I think that this is so urgent to deal with this, keeping this framework of climate-related racism and colonial capitalism in mind.
Thank you, Atana. Unless Ghislain or Inès have anything to add, which I don't think they do, because maybe they do. No. Sorry, it's unclear. We've only got 10 minutes left, so I wanted to thank again 350org for giving us a platform to share and exchange ideas together. And I'd like to also thank all of the panelists for their honest and enlightening testimonials and insightful answers and analyses. So thank you very much to Archana, Ghislain, Inès and Martin, who unfortunately had to leave. And lastly, I'd like to thank my colleague Sanka, who's here. He's been very supportive of this and has been driving our work around decolonizing conversations around the climate crisis at ENAR. So thank you, Sanka. And I wanted to take a second now to invite all of our panelists to offer some final remarks, but remind them to keep it short because we only have 10 minutes. But yeah, so I'd like to go to maybe Ghislain first.
Yes. Just quickly and shortly, and thanks for the organizer, and thanks to all people who are present here today, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I will end with a short sentence. Of course, we are here today talking about climate and race, but we must be all aware that this is not matter of color. This is matter of being human being, and being here today is very, very important, because we will not do this work only alone in our side. We will do this work all collective as human being. Of course, today we are facing the consequences of racialization. Of course, we are facing that, but it's important to say that we all know that race doesn't exist. We all human being. And it's important to think as human being and to think as ally, because we need to do this collectively as ally and just as human being. And I thanks everyone to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghislain. Maybe we could go to Inès next.
So those are closing remarks, right?
Yeah, just anything you wanted to add to kind of tie together or to remark on.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we need more and more spaces like that. I think we need to have them on a European level, but also on a national level, local level. And I think also I wanted to thank you for, you know, putting our stories and our struggles and our recommendations and our different, I know someone reacted to the term fight, but our fights are the thing we do on a daily basis to fight for our rights and put them in the scientific, you know, like space, like in a research. I think it's important that we are everywhere. I think it's important that we tell our stories in the media, that we write books, that we create our own research, it's important that we tell those stories and we create content everywhere just to be more visible, because at the end of the day is a lot all our issues that we face on a daily basis has a lot to do with the fact that we are not visible, we are not heard, we are not, taken into consideration, and any effort that we can do or our allies can do to shed lights on all those struggles and those intersections and those like very hidden points are what is going to advance this work. And so thank you for what you did and for inviting us today.
Thank you very much, Ines. And lastly, I'd like to come to you, Archana, if you wanted to kind of share any closing remarks.
Sure, thank you. I think 2 points. One, just also responding to that comment in the chat about violence. I mean, I absolutely hear this aspect of, colonialism, slavery, genocide, environmental destruction. All these things are super violent, and we don't want to reproduce these dynamics, but at the same time, I think, especially in the context of a largely white climate movement, it's important to understand racialized communities experience this as an assault every day, and so making room for people to express how that feels, and that it does feel like a fight, I think, as Ina said, on a daily basis, is really important to dismantling this colonial structure, which doesn't allow racialized communities to speak to their experiences even. So I think that's an important aspect to keep in mind. So that's one thing. And then somebody also put in the chat something, someone from Thailand saying, I think we deserve reparations. And I think that's absolutely a very central part of this. And Gisèle is also in the court case that GAN and other organizations are putting forward, demanding this, and absolutely that is a central part of any move to decolonize and to achieve any form of climate justice. So I think that is something we really need to start putting at the center, particularly in Europe. Particularly white climate organizations need to start putting this in the center. So, and and my closing remark that maybe seems less relevant now, but it's just that, in this, as you're engaging in the struggle for climate justice, keep these frameworks of colonial capitalism and the experiences shared here in mind when you organize. Use this as the jumping off point for your organizing. Center justice in your organizing so that we're moving towards more equitable societies and, not reinforcing these colonial and racist inequities. Thanks.
Thank you, Archana. Thank you again for your to my panelists, to our panelists for sharing their closing remarks. And thank you everyone who's here today for your engagement and your support. It's been a real pleasure having this discussion and having you kind of engaging and listening and asking questions. And I think that the conversations that we've had today have highlighted how Europe's history is responsible for the conditions that have created this climate crisis. But we know to this day that the European governments and institutions are continuing to push kind of neo-colonial foreign policies that continue to allow for climate destruction, not even just to allow for climate destruction, but in fact to perpetuate climate destruction. And to perpetuate the conditions that allow for climate destruction. And I think that our conversation today has kind of started to address why we need to decolonize European climate policies that impact the global south and also European communities in order to bring about radical system change that is kind and nurturing to our environment. And we need to be working towards global climate and racial justice, equality, equity. And to build on what Gisèle said, it's not just about race, it's about people, it's about humans, it's about human dignity, it's about people having access to the basics, to water, to food, to accommodation, to knowledge. And that's really what this conversation is about. So I think we're drawing to a close. We put our website in the chat. It's enar.eu.org, enar-eu.org. So you can keep your eyes peeled for our upcoming reports. If anybody has any questions, you can email me at nadia@enar-eu.org. But yeah, keep your eyes peeled on our website and social media for the report, and also all of the other exciting things we've got coming up. And yes, that's all kind of we had for you today. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you to the interpreters. Sorry,
Yeah.
I completely forgot that this was being interpreted the whole time. Thank you very much to our interpreters and to our technical support people. You've been amazing. We really appreciate it.